Hey there, 75B. Welcome back. Today I will be talking about Flannery O'Connor. It'll be fun. Couple things before we start. I'm front loading you with an early cut of what next week discussion topics will look like. Wording might change a little bit. I'll try not to deviate too much, but I know a lot of people have been expressing interest in getting those farther ahead in time in order to be able to kind of have that help guide their reading. So, coming up on this Saturday, we'll be looking at Theodore Roethke and Elizabeth Bishop, who are part of the confessional poetry movement, sometimes known as the domestic poetry movement. Um, in other words, um, bodies of poetry that explore familial relationships and also romantic relationships, but also the kind of repression and suppression and breakdown and trauma that sometimes come through them. Really good stuff. Really up. We'll also be looking at for next Monday. I'm sorry, next Wednesday, A Streetcar Named Desire. I'm talking a little bit about Southern Gothic literature today. Streetcar fits right into that by Tennessee Williams. Um, some of you might be familiar with some of the productions that have been made for screen or stage. I'm going to warn you, the play is a bit different. It's definitely different from the Simpsons episode, but stay tuned for that. It'll be a lot of fun. Let's get on to Flannery O'Connor. Wow, we are moving into an era now where a lot of the short fiction we're reading is going to feel, in some ways, hauntingly familiar to very contemporary work, both on the page and on the screen. And this contemporary sensibility is coming out. A lot of it's coming out of this mid-century moment. Flannery O'Connor is definitely one of those voices that is widely influential. Um, and if you read a short story by Flannery O'Connor, you're probably not going to forget it. Highly imaginative, but also highly disturbing at the same time. Back on track here, she was born in Savannah, Georgia, and lived with her mother near there in Midgeville. Excuse me, I'm not editing that out. What you do need to know about that is that she came from um, a fairly established family and was surrounded by different levels of social strata within Southern culture. Now, what that means is that she had a fine eye attuned to the certain social norms and mannerisms, but also biases and blind spots of people living in the South post Civil War. By people, I mean basically white Americans. And their sensibilities get put under the microscope quite a bit. Um, And like I alluded to a little bit earlier, there's a lot of dark humor in what she's saying. I mean, sometimes it's horrific, um, but it's certainly something that leaves a strong impression and may make you laugh at one instance, but also kind of step back or cringe at another. Um, and with that dark humor comes a very strong sense of regionalism. So, like I was saying earlier, um, it's not only about how people talk; it's what they say and what their belief systems are and how they perform, being a person from a certain class, from a certain ethnicity, at a certain point in the South. And again, I'm always beating myself to the bullets. It seems the speech patterns and the behaviors that she chronicles for most of her short fiction have a very distinctive Southern tilt to them. And a lot of that work gets reflected into like more contemporary things that we might see about the South. If you look up Southern Gothic as a genre, you will see her as one of the early practitioners of it. I don't think she necessarily liked that term. Um, that's a whole different story. I don't even have time to talk about that. I mean, it's a good placeholder. If you guys can think of something else that kind of captures all the things that I'm talking about, I'm open to it. But for better or for worse, it's just going to kind of have to stick for now until I hear something better. And she did like talking about the cliched oral philosophies of people and how they would sometimes fail them. You know, we all know people that whenever something happens, they've got something to say about it, and it's so broad and so general um, that they tend to be almost useless, you know. Um, and they lack specificity and are just kind of like filler space. Nobody's perfect. Everybody's got a heart or whatever. I mean, sometimes there's a really important sentiment in there. Other times it's just kind of like, if that's the most pointed thing that you have to say about what's happening right now, what is going on, man? You know, wake up, dig deeper. Don't just pull the string on your back and make that thing come out. Um, Here's a wonderful quote by O'Connor. Anytime, anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader, unless it is grotesque, in which case it is going to be called realistic. Um, I believe what we're seeing here in this quotation is that grim and ironic and a bit hyperbolic sense of humor that O'Connor employs so much in her short stories. Um, Not everything coming out of the South is grotesque. I think that's perfectly clear. Um, and she is kind of typifying or stereotyping, Northern readers in a certain way um, that I think is not completely accurate either. I mean, certainly all regions of the U.S. face certain prejudices and stereotypes that they have to work against. Um, but she goes on by saying if something is grotesque and comes out of the South, in which case it is going to be called realistic. It seems like she's even elevating the absurdity even farther. But she's got a bit of a point there. I mean, there was a certain, I think, kind of national voyeurism um, that America has with the South. Um, and it does bring popular images and sentiments to minds for lots of us, for better or for worse. If you happen to be reading a story on the internet, looking at the news, you see a story that starts Florida man, you're like, okay, get me the popcorn. Let's see what happened now. And again, that's based off of certain biases and stereotypes as well. So it is something that I think we ought to be mindful of. Oh, right. Wow, that came out like a public service announcement. Let's just go ahead and move on. Let me dig a little bit deeper for you. Let's talk about the Southern Gothic literary movement. Now, the Southern Gothic literary movement is really a reincarnation, a refashioning of the American Gothic literary movement that we saw had its inception by Edgar Allan Poe, followed up in some work by Nathaniel Hawthorne and others, traveling through into the 19th century with people like Mark Twain. And I think you could also put Ambrose Bierce in there as well. But I think it's going to be important for us to talk about a host of different literary elements that kind of orbit around this notion of what it is. And remember, not every element is going to apply in equal measure in all instances that are going to fall into that category. So, can we start off with characters that are extremely flawed and unconventional or unwell in some way? There is damage in a lot of Southern Gothic characters. The flaw could be just really naive or very off the beaten path or something not right about them. If you notice, Hulga is disabled, but she's certainly also unconventional, and she actually presents herself as a bit of a heroine in the story. Um, then we have antagonists in these narratives too, and they're often sheep, wolf in sheep's clothing. In other words, they come in as somebody kind of innocent and naive, perhaps, maybe pouring on the aw shucks charm a little bit, dripping honey. They may also be disguised or somehow hidden under the veil of victimhood of some kind. So, in other words, there's a certain uh, dubiousness to people's appearances as these narratives progress. They will often, but not always, take place in decaying or rundown or rural settings. Not all of them run down, not all of them are decaying, but that is a part of the Southern Gothic landscape. If you've ever read like Faulkner's Rose for Emily, think about that decaying mansion. If you think about the courthouse in Barn Burning, that courthouse is the general store, basically. So these, in some ways, are places that are still on the edge of nature, on the edge of raw rural existence in some ways. And the civilization that erupts or intrudes or imposes on this rural setting um, sometimes doesn't have its act together, has its own biases and flaws as well. We're also going to see horrific situations, contexts, and plot points, and they can often come out of, well, the bad things that humanity can offer: poverty, crime, violence, social alienation at some level. In other words, these things, these bad starting points make a bad situation worse. And the tone is going to feel ironic. You're going to see like a sense of opposition between how people talk and how they behave, or what they want to do and what they end up doing. Um, there's also certain morbidity, a preoccupation with death or injury. Um, and that sometimes it's going to feel very absurdist in some of these narratives. Like, wait, this is dreamlike in its scariness or strangeness, um, and that can be both humorous but also distancing and pause taking at the same time. And of course, we've also got themes of hypocrisy, violence, the loss of the past, and with that goes, of course, the fall of the antebellum South and its manners. Oh, the the great society and propriety and aristocracy of that South. Of course, that particular fantasy elides and covers up, the horrific bias and racism of slavery and the sexism of the time as well, and also classism, and of course racism just in general. Can I get this done in a minute? I'm going to try. So there are two stories in our Norton Reader. I'm only having you read Good Country People. The Life You Save May Be Your Own is also really good. But it's important to think about some of the characters that O'Connor likes to use again and again. The domineering mother in Mrs. Hopewell, we'll see. Also, the daughter at a crossroads in her life, Hulga, the psychiatry PhD. Manipulative and deceptive man, Manly Pointer. Could that be more on the nose? You could write a whole paper on that name. And you've got themes that she likes to use again and again: appearance versus reality, what it means to be a good person, and finally, gendered power dynamics. What are those differentials just based on gender? So that's great stuff. I hope you enjoy it. I made it in under 15 minutes. I'll be talking to you soon.